Welcome everyone to the 37th Annual Knox Lecture, put on by the Center for Ethics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs here at the University of St. Andrews. My name is Ben Sachs, and I'm the director of that center, known as SEPA. I just have a few people to thank very quickly. I'd like to thank Professor Sarah Brody, who is in the lecture theater with our speaker today. She is very kindly agreed to handle the Q&A period. I'd like to thank two members of the IT services team, Brenda Doby and Ramsey Peterson, who have taken on the complicated task of facilitating this lecture, which has been a bit of a technical feat because we're still figuring out how to operate online in these strange times. So thank you to them, and thank you to Lewis Wood from the principal's office and to Principal Mapstone herself. I just have one announcement, which is that the Knox seminar, which is a more in-depth, intimate discussion of the themes from the Knox lecture, will be held tomorrow at 2 p.m. British time. And if you look in the chat window of your Teams window, you'll see a message about that and a link which will help you get into the Knox seminar tomorrow. As you know already, our speaker this year is Professor John Haldane, and it's not my job to introduce him, but I will say that we have a very exciting announcement, which is that Professor Haldane has endowed what will be known as the Haldane Prize in Philosophy and Public Affairs. He has provided funds to endow in perpetuity a £250 yearly prize to be awarded to an excellent student essay on a matter of at the overlap of philosophy and public affairs, and SEPA is very excited to have those funds and to get on with the task of identifying and encouraging worthy student essays every year. So we want to offer our heartfelt thanks and gratitude to Professor Haldane for that initiative on his part. One further announcement is that after Professor Haldane is done with his lecture, there will be a half-hour Q&A session, and when you have a question, even if Professor Haldane is still speaking, what you simply need to do is open up the Q&A window in your Teams window and type in a question, and then Professor Brody will be selecting questions to put to Professor Haldane. Okay, my final job before I hand you over is to introduce Professor Sally Mapstone, who is the Principal and Vice Chancellor of the University of St. Andrews and will be introducing the Knox lecturer. Principal Mapstone has been in her post since 2016. As an academic, Professor Mapstone is a medievalist with expertise in the area of medieval and Renaissance Scottish literature. She is president of the Saltire Society, which champions Scottish culture, and she's a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Without further ado, then I hand you over to a recorded introduction by Professor Mapstone.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you all virtually to the 2020 Sir Malcolm Knox Memorial Lecture, to be delivered by Professor John Haldane, Emeritus Professor of Moral Philosophy at the University of St. Andrews and Senior Fellow at the University's Centre for Ethics, Philosophy and Public Affairs, or SEPA. The Knox Lecture Series was established by SEPA in 1985 to bring philosophical methods, insights and knowledge to bear on matters of public interest, and to encourage reflection on the ethical and philosophical aspects of public affairs. It is named for Sir Malcolm Knox, a philosopher of distinction and former principal of our university. Born in England in 1900, Sir Malcolm was of Scottish descent on both sides of his family, and his Scottishness was a strongly defining part of his identity. He read classics at the University of Oxford, then worked as secretary to Lord Leverhulme, and for various aspects of the Lever Brothers conglomerate, particularly in Africa. Sir Malcolm later returned to Oxford, where he combined bursarial and academic responsibilities at Jesus College, before being appointed lecturer in Greek philosophy at Queen's College. In 1936, Sir Malcolm assumed a chair of moral philosophy at St Andrews, where he spent the next 30 years. Sir Malcolm served as deputy principal under Sir James Irvine, and upon Sir James's death in 1952, he assumed the role of principal and Vice Chancellor the following year, which he held until 1966. One of his earliest interventions was to ensure that the phrase "to engage in research" was written, retrospectively when necessary, into the contracts of all lecturers and readers. In academic terms, Knox is known as the chief English translator of the writings of Hegel, whose work he first explored at Oxford under the tuition of R.G. Collingwood. His translation of the Philosophy of Right is the authoritative text published by Oxford University Press to this day, and he wrote broadly on Hegel's work and influence. Sir Malcolm continued to research until he died in 1980. The Knox Lecture was established 35 years ago to memorialise Sir Malcolm and with the support of his family. It is essential that events such as this, which are central to the intellectual life of our community, continue despite current logistical challenges caused by the need to social distance. I'd like to thank SEPA for organising this year's lecture, and in particular its director, Dr. Benjamin Sachs. Our speaker, Professor John Haldane, for being one of the first to deliver a socially distanced guest lecture at St Andrews, and our media services team who have responded to the situation with aplomb. So our guest speaker this evening, Professor John Haldane, will be familiar to many of you already. He is an irreplaceable and unmissable part of our St Andrews community, not only for his towering intellectual accomplishments, but also for his wide engagement with community activities such as this. It is our privilege to host Professor Haldane today. John received an unconventional introduction to philosophy. He first obtained a Bachelor of Arts in Fine Art from the University of the Arts, London, followed by a postgraduate certificate in education from the Institute of Education, London. John then worked as head of art at St Joseph's Grammar School in South London while studying for his second BA in philosophy at Birkbeck College, London. John left teaching to focus on postgraduate study, and he received his PhD from Birkbeck in 1984 with a thesis entitled Intentionality and Epistemological Realism. John's posting following the completion of doctoral study was as a lecturer in moral philosophy at St Andrews in 1983, and he has continuously held positions at our university since. John was appointed reader in 1990, professor in 1994, and emeritus professor of moral philosophy in January 2020. Whilst at St Andrews, he has served as head of the School of Philosophy, Anthropology and Film for 2 distinct periods, and he has served as director of SEPA. He served for 26 years, from 1988 to 2000, and then from 2002 to 2016. At with St Andrews, John was Royden B. Davies Chair in Humanities at Georgetown University from 2001 to 2002. He was J. Newton Raiser Senior Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at Baylor University, Texas, from 2015 to 2020. And since 2014, he has been visiting professor at the University of Birmingham's Jubilee Centre for Character and Virtues. Described as Scotland's best-known philosopher, John is a hugely distinguished and lauded academic whose work covers a broad range of philosophical topics. These include central issues in the philosophy of mind, the history of philosophy, including 18th and 19th century Scottish philosophy, social philosophy, ethics and aesthetics, and artistic and educational issues, including the role of art in theological education. These interests are explored in 7 books, 24 edited works, and some 200 papers. His most recent edited volume, The Life and Philosophy of Elizabeth Anscombe, which I have hugely enjoyed reading, was published in 2019. In recognition of his outstanding research career, John has delivered many major public lecture series, including the Gifford Lectures at the University of Aberdeen, and he has spoken at colloquia in over 20 countries. John served as papal consultor at the Vatican's Pontifical Council for Culture from 2005 to 2015, and he was appointed Knight of the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre in 2004 and Knight Commander in 2011. John was made a Fellow of both the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the Royal Society of Arts in 1995, and he's been awarded honorary doctorates from the University of Glasgow, St Anselm College in the US, and Notre Dame University in Australia. After Professor Haldane's talk, there will be a question and answer session hosted by Professor Sarah Brodie, OBE, so please do submit questions throughout the event. For now, I am so pleased to hand over to our 2020 Knox lecturer, Professor John Haldane, who will deliver his lecture, Philosophy and Public Affairs in Historical Perspective.
Well, welcome, and thank you to the Principal for that very generous introduction. This is, for me, a very special occasion, returning to St Andrews from the United States, coming home. I suppose in anticipating giving this lecture, I imagined that I'd be seeing before me colleagues and friends. Well, I do have one colleague who is also a friend, Professor Sarah Brodie, who, as you've heard, will be assisting with receiving and relaying questions and observations at the end of the lecture. And I also have a long-standing friend, so good a friend that she's my wife, who's also joined us today, plus the 2 members of the university IT services who very helpfully and very effectively set up today's proceedings. So I'm going to be in this lecture, as the title indicates, looking at philosophy and public affairs in historical perspective. And some of that history will be rather immediate, some of it will be rather deep and long distance, but I will also be exploring the ways in which history enters into philosophical thinking about ethical and other questions. So as I say, I'm very grateful for this invitation. In a way, the conditions under which I'm giving it are oddly apt, since one of my themes is going to be the importance of events, not necessarily intellectual events, in setting both the agenda for philosophy and the way in which philosophers think about those issues. So the fact that we are in circumstances of a kind of minor plague with COVID, but also in the midst of very significant social and political disruptions marked by protests in the United States and across the world in consequence of the recent killing, but by no means a unique event, the recent killing of an African American by police in the United States. This year, I entered my 5th decade of membership of the University of St Andrews. I was appointed in 1983, as I think the Principal mentioned. And this is also the start of the 5th decade of SEPA, because it was founded in 1984. It was originally founded under the title Centre for Philosophy and Public Affairs. Ethics was added some years later. Now, there are a multiplicity of connotations in my title. I'm going to be looking at the outset at SEPA in historical perspective, looking at the origins of the Centre for Ethics, Philosophy and Public Affairs. I will then be looking briefly at philosophy and public affairs as a practice, or a form of a movement, an intellectual movement, looking at that in historical perspective. And then I'll be looking at philosophy and public affairs themselves in historical perspective. So let me start first of all with SEPA itself. Like so many aspects of UK philosophy in the past 50 years, SEPA's inspiration owes much to events and intellectual developments in the United States. In 1969, a meeting was held in New York that founded the Society for Philosophy and Public Policy. The following year, that society changed its name to the Society for Philosophy and Public Affairs. And a year after that, Marshall Cohen, Thomas Nagle, and Tim Scanlon founded the journal Philosophy and Public Affairs. So very rapidly, between 1969 and 71, this phrase came into being, and in association with both a society and an academic journal, and a journal that very quickly achieved distinction and has retained that. Around the same time, beginning in 1969, there was the foundation of a series of centres. The first, I think, of those was the Hastings Centre in the state of New York, which has been associated with bioethics. There were some other starts, and some of them didn't endure, but 1976, my apologies, saw the foundation of the Philosophy and Public Policy Centre, initially in DC and then at the University of Maryland. Now, one can ask oneself the question, why did these initiatives occur when they did? And here I think one has to look to events, not to events within the academy, but to events within the wider society. And specifically, the Vietnam War and the reporting of atrocities committed by US troops in the course of that. Secondly, legal and political debates around abortion. And thirdly, the practice of civil disobedience. The third, of course, being related to, not exclusively to, but related to protests over the Vietnam War and also over such matters as racial segregation and attempts to overcome that. Now, I just mentioned a couple of notes here. First of all, although I want to make the point that the US developments were an inspiration for the founding of SEPA, it is worth noting a distinction between the environment in the United States and here in the UK, then and continuingly, though to some extent here in the UK matters are changing in this respect also. The context was constitutionalism, and within that, the division of powers. There is, interestingly, a St Andrews connection in this matter, because James Wilson, who was born between here and Cooper nearby in 1742, and entered this university, indeed the quadrangle in which I'm standing now, or the exterior quadrangle, entered that in 1757, was an active proponent, in the face of much opposition, to the idea of the separation of powers, and to the idea, obvious as it seems to us now, but it didn't to those involved in defining or drafting the Constitution, the idea that the president should be elected by the people. Wilson was an advocate of strong government, but he thought that had to be compensated for, or checks had to be set against that in different ways. One was that what he called the chief magistrate, the chief executive, what we now of course known as the president, should be elected by the people. And secondly, however, that there should be a separation of the executive power from the legislative power and from the judiciary. His opponents favoured the idea that Congress would elect the president, though there was another party that suggested that the individual states should elect the president. There was a kind of compromise which is exists today, which is the Electoral College. I think, by the way, that Wilson's inspiration in this probably derives from his Presbyterianism, because the Presbyterian ecclesiology favours the idea that the minister is called, as it were, by the congregation. It is a kind of democratic principle. And he felt that likewise the president should be called by the people. Now, there is, I think, a connection between this political economy that Wilson played an important role in shaping. He was a delegate to the Second Continental Congress. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was a participant in the Constitutional Convention. He was a signer of the Constitution. There's a connection between this and the way in which those issues that I mentioned a moment ago, the discussion of the Vietnam War, the discussion of debates around abortion, and the discussion of the practice of civil disobedience, the form that those took in the United States was connected with the US Constitution, because a very central element in that, the judiciary, was then and continues to be the place in the United States where these ethical and social debates come to their highest point of resolution in being brought before the Supreme Court. Of course, the Supreme Court decides which cases it will hear. The Federal Supreme Court decides which cases it will hear. But in making those choices, it's sensitive to and alert to the state of public debate around these issues. That's an uncomfortable position for it to be in, because it becomes the focus of all sort of protest and agitation and petition and so on. But for the most part, I would say that Supreme Court justices have taken their role seriously in choosing to consider cases such as Roe versus Wade, for example, in relation to abortion, to consider cases and to see this as part of their function in the resolution of those. I may just mention here in passing a very interesting essay by the American philosopher and jurisprudent, as we might say, Brian Leiter, on the role of the Supreme Court as an ultimate legislative body. This is a slightly provocative way of putting the point, but I think that the point that he makes is a good one, which is that although we have a separation of powers in the United States, the role of the judiciary, specifically the Supreme Court, is extremely important in the determination of social and political policy. Now, a further note to make here is that it is interesting, and this is going to be related to my broader thesis about the relationship between events and moral thinking. It's worth noting a parallel between the social circumstances that gave rise to the founding of these various institutions and societies that I mentioned, the Society for Philosophy and Public Affairs, the Journal, and other centres, and so on. A parallel between the situation obtaining then with respect to debates about war, abortion, and disobedience, and debates obtaining in the present day in the United States, but more extensively, between conflicts over justice, what justice requires or does not require, particularly in relation to economics, the fate of capitalism, and race relations. Secondly, sort of standing in parallel with the issue of abortion in the late 1960s and early 70s, is the whole area of LGBT and other identity issues. And then I think paralleling the debates around civil disobedience are contemporary concerns around the issues of policing and government control. So I think that we find ourselves in a situation that is in some respects parallel to that which gave rise to the philosophy and public affairs movement in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And it will be interesting to observe quite what the impact is at the level of disciplined, organized intellectual reflection, such as philosophy and other disciplines practice, what the impact will be of these events that are going on today, whether they will change the way in which philosophy engages with public practice, or change the way in which philosophy does its own business. And the third note, just to make at this point, is that as well as morally and politically charged events and processes, there are also, in trying to understand developments that have produced this whole movement of philosophy and public affairs, but more generally, movements and shifts and changes and developments in ideas, there's also the matter of material causes. Now, I'm using material causality here in a rather broad way that would be familiar to Marxists, and behind that really too, I suppose, the Hegelian theme, though Hegel would, I think, be less comfortable talking about material causes. He'd rather perhaps talk about ideational or spiritual causes. Just to illustrate this, in the 1970 saw the initiation in the United States of public broadcasting. This is something at television level that didn't exist before. 72, of course, famously the Watergate break-in, but an event that had quite significant impact, but which has not, people are not sufficiently aware of this, I think, perhaps, was the super outbreak of 1974, which was the second largest series of tornadoes in history. 148 tornadoes hit 13 US states. And one of the effects of this was to change the relationship between state government and federal government. And much of what has continued as a disputed theme in American politics about the levels of government and the relation of federal government, and which is very much to the fore currently in responses to COVID, has its origins in such events as the super outbreak of 1974. So I think material causality, as it were, is rather relevant to the question of why do people think what they think and when they think it. Now, returning to the foundation of SEPA, it was founded in 1984. I was a member of that original creation, along with two other members of the then moral philosophy department. Tony Ellis, now of Virginia Commonwealth University, and Gordon Graham, who later left St Andrews to become Regius Professor of Moral Philosophy at Aberdeen, and thereafter took a senior position at Princeton Theological Seminary in the United States, but has recently retired from that and returned to Scotland. I think it is perhaps no accident that all three of us involved in the first days of the centre have felt the lure of the United States. In the case of Tony Ellis going there and remaining there, in the case of Gordon Graham going there for a good number of years, now returning, and in my case, going periodically there, first to the University of Pittsburgh in the 1980s, then to Georgetown at the turn of the millennium, then to the University of Notre Dame, and then most recently to Baylor University in Texas. Because for anybody who's interested in philosophy and public affairs, the US has a particular attraction because of the high quality of commentary, but because of this constitutional context in which has given rise to the very developed practice of jurisprudence in the United States. This is something that features in Scottish legal education, partly because of the Roman law tradition of Scots law, but less so in the common law tradition in England. The philosophy of law or jurisprudence is not a required part of legal training in England, but jurisprudence is a very prominent feature of Scottish legal training and academic law, and as it is in the United States. And so for anybody who's interested in philosophy and public affairs, the United States has a particular, as it were, fascination. Of the three people I've mentioned, myself, Tony Ellis and Gordon Graham, really the inspired genius and impresario in all of this was Gordon Graham. It was really very much his idea. Tony Ellis was chairman of the Department of Philosophy and on that basis became academic director. I had only been appointed a year, and so I was given the status of a fellow. This is a status that's never been revoked. I think in more recent years I became a senior fellow, so I can say that I've been a fellow of SEPA since its foundation in 1984. It was encouraged with two aims. One, to encourage research in areas of philosophy most pertinent to discussion of topics of public importance, and secondly, to facilitate discussion of those same topics between philosophers and others whose concerns are more directly practical. For example, politicians, public servants, lawyers, educationalists, healthcare workers, and so on. Those aims, it was conceived that those aims should be pursued in a variety of ways, and indeed they have been. In fact, the ways in which they've been pursued have been broadened and deepened. There would be teaching within and beyond St Andrews, and Tony Gordon and I were involved in, for example, taking a course around nursing colleges in Scotland would be one example of that. And later I worked for gave lectures for and seminars for the Judicial Skills Committee of the Scottish Judiciary. Research, obviously, writing, organising seminars and so on, visiting fellowships. We had 100 visiting fellows, including 2 members of Parliament. Publications in 2004, the establishment of St Andrews Studies in Philosophy and Public Affairs, and public lectures, of which this at the Malcolm Knox lecture is the most prominent, and indeed the one that has been given continuously. The Principal Mapstone mentioned some facts about Malcolm Knox's life. I just add 2 other contributions that he made to philosophy here at St Andrews and more broadly in Scotland. First of all, he was the founder of the Philosophical Quarterly, and secondly, he was the founder of the Scots Philosophical Association. I want just to mention briefly, this sort of information is available on the SEPA website, but I just wanted to mention briefly some of the Knox lectures, just to give you a flavour of just how much, what good things were done. The first one, in fact, was given by Lord Quinton in 1985, but thereafter, and I'll just select a few here, we had John Rawls on political liberalism and its public role, Alistair MacIntyre on the politics of truth-telling and lying, Bernard Williams on equality, liberty and resentment, Mary Warnock on the idea of moral consensus, Honora O'Neill on principles, judgments and institutions, Charles Taylor on 2 theories of modernity, Richard Rorty, Is It Possible to Love Truth, Martha Nussbaum, Feminism and Internationalism, Derek Parfit, Reasons and Rationality, Joseph Raz, Personal Attachments and Universal Values, Alan Ryan, Liberal Imperialism, Hilary Putnam, Just and Unjust Wars, John Broome, for a time a colleague of ours, The Ethics of Global Warming, Quentin Skinner, Utilitarian Discovery About Liberty, Peter Singer, Living Ethically in the 21st Century, and most recently Susan Wolfe, Criticising Blame. I want to return later to an aspect of the theme of John Rawls's lecture. It was advertised as political liberalism and its public role, but it was published under a title much more familiar, The Idea of an Overlapping Consensus. I may say in this connection that when I was soliciting Rawls to give this lecture, encouraging, appealing, and so on, he said that at that point he wasn't really interested in giving public lectures. It was work he was trying to get on with. That work was the book, Political Liberalism, but that he would make an exception and give this lecture. And the reason that he would do so was his indebtedness to Sir Malcolm Knox. And the cause of his indebtedness was to Knox's translation of Hegel's Philosophy of Right. And Rawls made the point to me very firmly, actually, that the indebtedness that he felt that academics who didn't have the languages in which works originally had been published, or perhaps had them only imperfectly and partially and so on, the indebtedness that we had, and which should be acknowledged, 2 translators of philosophical works. And it was, I mentioned that, of course, because we're honouring Sir Malcolm Knox here, but as Sally Mapstone said, Knox's translation of the philosophy of right remains today the preferred available translation. I mean, there are others that have joined it, but it really has stood the test of time and is an enduring tribute to his scholarship as well as to his industry. Now, let me just say something next about the conception of philosophy, or philosophy's engagement, that was shared by those of us involved from the outset, Gordon Graham, Tony Ellis and myself. It was no part of our idea that we should be engaged in what you might call popularizing philosophy. That was something that then didn't really exist, but has become a rather prominent activity, of course, with all sorts of products, and many of them useful to people, engaging for people, and so on. But we weren't interested in popularizing philosophy. We didn't see that as being our aim or purpose. Secondly, we didn't think of bringing philosophy into connection with issues in public affairs as being a matter of kind of reducing philosophy to its elements, of saying, well, you know, you're interested in, let us say, I don't know, philosophy and questions of patient consent. Well, here's what philosophy has to say about consent in 3 points, as it were. That wasn't what we were seeking to do. Yes, introducing people who are not philosophers to philosophical ways of thinking, but not reducing philosophy to a series of bullet points. Thirdly, we were not interested in what had already been given a name and subsequently became itself a movement, the applied philosophy movement. The conception of philosophy's relation to practice that we shared, though we might have expressed it in slightly different ways, wasn't that of analogous to, say, a pure mathematics relation to applied mathematics. This is where you do the mathematics and then you apply it in the context of engineering or hydraulics or whatever else it may be. Rather, I think the term that I would favour, and I think my colleagues then might also have favoured, was the idea of practical philosophy, where practical philosophy is not to be understood in terms of sort of do-it-yourself book, but rather the more ancient tradition of philosophy oriented towards the good, in contrast, say, to speculative philosophy, whose target is the true. Now, I think related to that, I should say, was that some of those who were involved in the beginnings of this philosophy and public affairs movement, if I can call it that, in the United States and here, and I should intrude at this point and say that the St Andrews Centre was the first centre in the United Kingdom in this area of philosophy and practice. There was already something in law, but so far as philosophy is concerned, this was the first centre in the United Kingdom. I think it's irrelevant to this that some of the people in the US who were involved in this, and some here, certainly this was my own case, our background was not in moral philosophy. We had interest in ethical issues, but our philosophical background was in, at least mine was, in the areas of metaphysics and the philosophy of mind. And I think to some extent that protected us. I don't protect's not the right word, but at any rate, it meant that we did not suffer some of the insecurities that moral philosophers of the period suffered, of feeling that somehow their branch of philosophy more generally was seen by the mainstream as being a rather sort of secondary activity, and something, and particularly if you were going to engage in practical questions, that something would just really be the expression of opinions or something of that sort. So I think that there was a sort of lack of that insecurity, but then I think also there was an appetite to do philosophy in a rigorous way, that it certainly shouldn't just be a question of, as it were, evincing moral sentiment with regard to certain issues. And I think that one, I would say, problematic aspect of some of the recent engagement with philosophers with contentious moral, political and social issues is that a lot of this has simply taken the form of evincing or giving expression to their own opinions on the matters, often forcefully, but without very much rigorous argumentation or analysis of those issues. That the thing has become partisan in a way that I think is not only distasteful, but intellectually unhelpful. Now, you might say, well, were there not precedents to this? And thinking about that, one might, if one was sort of familiar with this history, think of Bertrand Russell, say, or a less well-known and a less distinguished figure, C.E.M. Joad. It's true that Russell and Joad in the 40s and 50s were quite prominent through BBC programs like the Brains Trust and so on, in commentary, and they were professional philosophers commenting on public affairs. But in their case, this really was a matter of giving opinions, and there was little philosophy in the presentation of those. When Bertrand Russell wrote about marriage, for example, or indeed in his opposition to nuclear weapons, he wasn't engaging in that very much as a philosopher. He happened to be a philosopher who had opinions and gave voice to them, interestingly, and ditto with Joad. But this really wasn't a philosophical inquiry or engagement with those issues. A second precedent one might think of, perhaps, if one goes back to the 19th century, both middle and later, would be to think of, say, John Stuart Mill, and then later, and in part in response to Mill and to the liberal utilitarians, people like T.H. Green and the British idealists more generally. Now, in their case, I think there was philosophical engagement, but, and I leave Mill to one side here because I think Mill genuinely was exceptional, but for the most part, they were working at the level of very general theory about value or metaphysics. So the British idealists, including the Scottish idealists, one of whom, R.B. Haldane, was offered the chair of moral philosophy here at St Andrews, gave a Gifford lectures here at St Andrews, and was liberal, and then Labour Lord Chancellor. Their reflections on Hegelian, and they were all Hegelians, their reflections on and expressions of Hegelian philosophy were at a very general level. And then, of course, they had their own opinions about particular matters of practice. But I think there is a precedent, but we have to go further and deeper, a precedent for something that is, as it were, in spirit, connected with what I've described as this form of practical philosophy, philosophical engagement with practical questions, and that is the casuistical tradition. Now, the idea of casuistry, of course, rather fell into disrepute. Casuistry is the consideration of cases. The place where it was preserved, I'll say in a moment why it fell into disrepute, but the place where it was preserved was in law. And just the very term, case law, I mean, the practice of law in considering the conditions and circumstances of culpability, whether it be in the situation of criminal law or in civil law with regard to torts and so on, the kind of thinking that lawyers engage in there, in presenting a case, defending against a charge or a tort, and a judge in arbitrating and so on, the kind of thinking that's involved is connected with a broader tradition of casuistry that very much developed in the Middle Ages in the Latin West. It is in some respects connected also with an older Jewish tradition of debating questions or issues, particularly in relation to the Torah and thinking about ethical questions or questions of law and command and how these can be interpreted and what leeway there is and so on. The reason that it fell into disrepute, I think, particularly in Britain, was because of its association with Catholic moral theology. It was seen as partly suspicious just on those grounds, but also because of the practice, the so-called Jesuitical practice of a kind of sophistry, or what was at least seen as a kind of sophistry. And I think for these two reasons, anything that sort of smacked of casuistry was thought of as not being intellectually respectable. But I'm going to suggest in a moment that not only is it intellectually respectable, it is intellectually rather important and valuable, and some part of it should be recovered today. In fact, I think that if we're looking for a precedent in more recent times, then a very useful place to look at would be in philosophy, I mean, and in Anglo-American philosophy, say Anglophone philosophy, to include Australia, would be Elizabeth Anscombe's 1939 essay, The War and the Moral Law. Now, it's worth pointing out that when Anscombe wrote that, she was 20 years old. She was an undergraduate student. It was part of a co-authored pamphlet and published by the authors with the support of an association, which I'll mention in a moment. That pamphlet was published under the title The Justice of the Present War Examined. But Anscombe's contribution to it was an essay, The War and the Moral Law. The previous year, Anscombe had become a member of PAX, which was a anti-war movement, a Roman Catholic anti-war movement. And in the years immediately preceding that, there'd been quite a lot of literature written by a Dominican. She was received into the Catholic Church in Oxford, having been under instruction by a Dominican. And the same year as her pamphlet, and published somewhat ahead of it, was a book called Morality and War, in which the author Gerald Van sets out in some detail the just war doctrine, the conditions of just war, and so on. Now, Anscombe published her essay in 1939, but this really began, I was going to say she was distracted by, let's say she was engaged by Wittgenstein in the course of the war, and so her interest somewhat shifted. But by about the early 1950s, her mind had moved back into the issues that she'd been concerned about in the war and the moral law, specifically the killing of innocents. And this becomes an abiding subject for her, not just through the 1950s, but all the way through her life. And a familiar piece of hers, of course, one of the most familiar pieces of ethical writing, academic ethical writing of since the 1950s, modern moral philosophy, has as one of its themes a characterization of Oxford moral philosophy, going back to the intuitionism of Ross through to the prescriptivism of Hare. But she traces this all the way back to Sidgwick, who of course was at Cambridge. She identifies in all of this what she calls consequentialism. Not necessarily the same as utilitarianism, though that would be its most familiar expression, but the idea that there are no intrinsic prohibitions which such that it would always and everywhere be wrong to violate them. Now, there's a connection here, a historical connection with Thomas Nagle, who, as I mentioned earlier on, was one of the founders of the journal Philosophy and Public Affairs. Nagle had done his undergraduate studies at Cornell, where he was introduced to the philosophy of Wittgenstein by Norman Malcolm and Max Black. Malcolm, of course, having been a student of Wittgenstein's. And rather on the recommendation of Malcolm, he went to Oxford to continue his studies. This is Nagle I'm talking about, on a Fulbright. And there encountered Anscombe and became influenced by her ethical writings, particularly her writings around the question of the killing of innocent, absolute prohibitions, violations of justice, and so on. And he himself, in the second issue of Philosophy and Public Affairs, published an essay with the title War and Massacre, which pays homage, as it were, or due acknowledgement, both in its title and in the text, to Anscombe's writings on this matter, particularly her address on the question of Mr. Truman's degree, where she famously opposed Oxford University's decision to give Truman an honorary degree on the grounds that she regarded him as a mass murderer. As Nagle writes in that essay of his, War and Massacre, the philosopher who's done most to advance contemporary philosophical discussion of just war and to explain it to those unfamiliar with its extensive treatment in Roman Catholic moral theology is Elizabeth Anscombe, and then he goes on to discuss Truman's degree. Now, I think this is an interesting example. I mean, this Anscombe's discussion of the question of just war, which she began as an undergraduate student, which then gave rise in her own mind to moral reflections, and then to philosophical inquiry, and then to philosophical discovery, and then to the shaping of moral philosophy, and then to the return of all of that to practice. Let me just quote from that pamphlet, her essay. This is the 20-year-old Anscombe. She begins, before considering whether or not there are any persons who may not be attacked in war, we must try to elucidate in however crude a fashion the doctrine of intention in human acts. For in all actions of rational beings, we can distinguish three ends of action. There is the motive or motives of the agent, the proper effects of the act as such, and the completed act itself. These are not always distinct, in fact, but they can be. If they do coincide, this does not make them less distinct in nature, though the distinction is sometimes subtle. This is a 20-year-old who a few years later would find it necessary in pursuing this question of trying to determine the quality of acts and the role of intention in that, would find it necessary to write a monograph, Intention, which is now widely and rightly regarded as one of the classics of a British philosophy of the post-war period. So here's a case in which, in responding to events, in thinking about these morally, a philosophical inquiry ensues, philosophical discoveries are made, and those then in turn inform moral philosophy and then in turn are reapplied to questions of practice. Now, I'm going to have to move along fairly speedily now, but I just want to go a bit deeper into history. And in doing that, let me just sort of summarize what I think of as three grades or 3 degrees of historical involvement. First of all, there's the way in which moral thinking is influenced by events and historical processes, and I offer Anscombe's essay as an example of that, but also the founding events of philosophy and public affairs in the United States as another example of that. The sort of events that would be relevant to this would be questions of urbanization, economic and technological developments, and calamities. So urbanization in the 12th and 13th century is relevant to a case study I'm going to come to shortly in medieval thought. But urbanization in the 18th and 19th centuries is one of the drivers of the rise of utilitarianism as a social philosophy in Bentham, Lord Brougham, James Mill, and then carrying forward to his son, John Stuart Mill. And we can think in terms of these events, perhaps having in mind things like the Industrial Revolution, the automation of manufacture, the development of weapons of mass destruction, the development of aerial bombardment, the discovery of antibiotics, the development of reliable oral contraceptives, plague, AIDS, and through to the present day with COVID. Each of these events or processes giving rise to certain kinds of social reactions, which in turn give rise to ethical reflection. Now, the second degree of involvement is not just where moral thinking responds to events and processes, but in which the concepts are fashioned in those responses. So this is a more substantial involvement of history in philosophy because it actually is shaping the concepts. Rather than these concepts being, as it were, a priori derivations, they come out of thinking about the particular issues. And I'll just mention briefly 3 or 4 examples of this and just give a little bit more attention to one of them. One example, which I think is very interesting and not discussed as far as I'm aware, is the distinction between the objective and the subjective in a particular understanding of that. Of course, it had been the case from the ancient world that a philosopher could ask the question, is something good because we desire it, or do we desire it because it's good? And of course, the idea that it's good because we desire it is labeled as a kind of subjectivism. But I'm thinking of subjectivity in a different way. This is the distinction in determining the evaluation of an individual's action or of a group's action, the distinction between, as it were, the objective character of what has been done and the subjective condition of the agent. So questions of culpability, motive, knowledge, character, and so on fall under the heading of the subjective. And then in more recent times, one can think of these questions of culpability, motive, knowledge, and character as being drawn upon to characterize the moral character of institutions. So the very idea, for example, of institutional racism often has with it the suggestion that no individual is being accused here necessarily. Of course, they may be individuals to be accused, but that an institution can be structurally unjust. This is a sort of development of the idea of subjective culpability. But that notion, I think, the distinction between the objective and the subjective, as I'm using it just now, the objective gravity of the matter, the wrongness of what was done, and the culpability of the agent in respect of it, and the fact that these may come apart, actually has its origins, I believe, or at least its development, in the whole literature of penitential rights and confessional manuals, because it's precisely the responsibility in the confessional to determine the question of the individual's culpability in these matters. And so the concept of gravity of matter, of objective wrongness, of subjective culpability becomes, as it were, a fine point of confessional practice. A second example is the distinction between combatant and non-combatant immunity. Again, we saw that a moment ago with Anscombe, but this concept of non-combatant immunity, I believe, is not just an instance of a more general concept of innocence. I think it's a specific concept that can only be understood in terms of its specific subject matter. A third example, I think, is that of the status of promising as a distinct moral phenomenon. I think that's related to questions of law and commerce. And the fourth example I would give, because there's an example which I've already in a way referred to, but I'm not going to go through now, which is the just war, the doctrine of just war. But the example I'll just mention and give a moment or two to is that of supererogation. Now, the first bit of moral philosophy in the analytical mode that one might think of as being associated with that was written in 1958, the same year as Anscombe's Modern Moral Philosophy, by Urmson on saints and heroes. But the roots of this lie in moral theology. And this is the distinction between precepts and counsels, the distinction between, on the one hand, commandments and so-called counsels of perfection. And if one goes to Matthew 19, you get, if you would enter into eternal life, keep the commandments. If you would be perfect, go sell what you have and give to the poor, and you shall have treasure in heaven. And this introduces the idea of a distinction between, as it were, what is required and what goes beyond what is required, what is beyond due payment. I offer this these as examples of where concepts have been fashioned in response to thinking about practical questions. It's not a matter of applying concepts to practical questions. The ethical concepts are themselves fashioned in response to that. Now, the deepest level of historical involvement, and here I would just have to be brief. For this, I think we return to Hegel, well, to Marx, and behind Marx, Hegel. But behind Hegel, again, a theological idea, the notion of sacred history. Now, the very broad idea here is that history, events and processes, are embodiments of reason. And how should we understand this? Well, let's separate off transcendental non-empirical metaphysics. Let's set aside the theological notion of divine providence of a way in which reason is immanent in history. And let's set aside the Hegelian idea of absolute spirit as being operative in history. What, if anything, can we retain from this idea that history is itself an embodiment of reason? Well, I think it's this, that the priority of action over thought, that, as it were, the first life of ideas is as virtual in action, that the scholastics have a slogan, agere sequitur esse, that acting follows upon being. That as well, the agency of a thing, even its rational agency, are immanent, or that its reason is immanent within its deeds. That the articulation of those reasons at the level of ideas is posterior to their operation at the level of action. Or to have another scholastic slogan, the slogan lex orandi, lex credendi, lex vivendi, that the law of prayer is the law of belief, is the order of living, or the way we worship is the way we believe, is the way we live, connects in a way non-contingently practice and thought, but in a way gives priority to practice. Now, I just want in conclusion to return to Rawls and to the issue that concerned him in his lecture, the lecture that was published as an idea of an overlapping consensus, which, as many of you will know, is part of, or becomes part of, his book, Political Liberalism. Rawls's concern is obviously with justice, but unlike a theory of justice, where he was concerned with the distribution of goods, if you like, with economic justice, broadly understood, in political liberalism, he's concerned with a different question, which is the just arbitration between competing claims rooted in diverse philosophical, ethical, religious commitments. And Rawls was very concerned that there was a risk in America of something like analogous to the religious wars of Europe that had bedeviled Europe in the period following the Reformation. And he looked at the issues of, say, abortion and the civil rights issues, the issues that I mentioned earlier on, which had been a motive for him in his work on a theory of justice, but he saw these now as threatening as well the peace and stability of the state. And so he wanted to work out an account of liberalism that would enable people to live together under conditions of radical disagreement. And part of his solution was the idea of public reason, that in deliberations about matters of public policy, again, broadly considered, that one should restrict oneself to reasons that would be reasonably acceptable to others in those debates. Now, for reasons of time, I'm going to be very brief here. I'm just going to say that this idea of public reason as a constraint faces a number of challenges. First of all, it partitions reasoning about issues between the moral and the political. And that partitioning, just like the partitioning between the moral and the prudential, is something that might itself be contested. The idea that I should separate off my moral convictions in order to find political reasons to ground institutions of which I will be party. It results in a certain formalism. It excludes deep beliefs and practices. And a further factor is it's unengageable. I'm not going to get this. People find it difficult to engage with it who are not capable of or not familiar with a certain kind of discursive rationality and articulacy. So how then to proceed? Well, here I'm just going to go back to the Middle Ages briefly, and I want to just draw your attention to a discussion in Aquinas, which deserves and needs much more time than I'm going to be able to give it now, of questions of discord and contention. But broadly, the strategy I want to propose is this. First of all, conceive, in contrast to Rawls, conceive of liberalism not as an abstract construction of reason, but as a modus vivendi, sustained not by argument, but by sensibility, the cultivation of what one call liberal sensibility. Secondly, cultivate certain affections and dispositions. And then in that connection, distinguish between the beliefs and values that one is committed to and one's attitude to believers and valuers. Now, in conclusion and briefly, I just want to indicate a way forward here. In the Summa Theologiae, the Secunda Secundae, the second part of the second part, Aquinas considers charity as a concern for the good of others. And he then turns to discuss vices contrary to or opposed to charity. And he identifies a number of these, but for present purposes, the ones that I'm concerned with are discord and contention. Now, discord, he says, divides the heart, divides one's own heart. One can be at odds within one's own heart, but it also divides hearts. My heart, your heart, we become divided through discord. And he says that action may be discordant in one of two ways. It may be discordant per se, where the agent intends dissent from a good. This is a peculiar corruption of the mind, but nonetheless it's something that exists. But the other kind of discord is discord per accidens, where dissent arises in pursuit of the good. So people are both pursuing the good, but they have different views about what that good is or how it might be achieved. And he proceeds from that to discuss contention, which is opposition in opinion. And he says that contention can involve intention. One can intend to oppose what is said, and that is contention, properly speaking. But there's also the manner of contention in respect of the person and in respect of the issue. And what he then goes on to discuss is inordinate contention. That's to say, opposition in opinion that is disproportionate either to the person or to the issue at hand. And he thinks there's a kind of corruption, a kind of vice, when one invests one's opposition, which may be sincere opposition, with a disproportionate attitude. Either it's disproportionate to the person with whom you are in debate, or it's disproportionate to the matter at issue. And the question is then, what is the answer? Well, the answer for Aquinas is the cultivation of the virtue of charity, which begins with an examination of conscience, of thought, of word, and of deed. Or, as we might say, following the Hegelian inversion, an examination of deed, of word, and of thought. That asking oneself, look, is how I am behaving in this discussion, these matters that are under dispute, am I being contentious in the respect of inappropriately opposing an opinion? Not that opposing an opinion is wrong, but that I may be opposing in a certain way that is inappropriate, that it's either disrespectful or unsuitable to the person, or it's disproportionate to the issue. Or again, moving backwards, am I being discordant? Am I being discordant needlessly per accidens, or am I being discordant worse per se? And what I will end on is just this thought, that just as we can find some of the roots of philosophy and public affairs in some of the ideas of the medieval thinkers more generally, whether it's a question of just war, the question of promising, the question of the supererogatory, and so on, so I think in this issue that has become dominant in modern political philosophy, particularly following Rawls, this question of how to manage disagreement and difference, we might usefully look again to the medievals, in this case Aquinas, and to the discussion of discord and contention, and fit what we find there into an aspect of the Scottish philosophical tradition, the tradition of sensibility, in the cultivation of certain affections. And these affections that I'm concerned with here are constituent of the idea of civic friendship. And so this is not to have conducted an investigation, but to have proposed the form of an investigation that links practice and thought, and that brings philosophy to bear on questions of public affairs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John.
Not at all, Sarah.
Wonderful lecture ranging over so much history, and including, of course, history of our own centre and of the part played by Scottish philosophy in all this, and these huge issues about philosophical theory and philosophical practice, and how all different ways over the centuries in which thinkers have tried to make sense of them. Now, I haven't got more, at the moment I have two questions. The first is from Brazil. It's from a doctoral student called Dan Costa Leiter, who's a PhD in classics in Sao Paulo. And he writes in first to thank you for your lecture, and then to ask, he would like to know what you think about the changing balance of establishing checks amongst the powers. I think he must mean the three powers in contemporary republics.
Thank you. This question, I think, is a very important one. It's important in the United States, but it's also important more generally as there is a trend in politics to constitutionalism. It's long been remarked, often people who make this observation tend to do so critically, but Britain lacks an explicit constitution. And it's thought that it's really unfit that a democracy should not have a constitution, as it were, a political rule book, not of just everyday procedure and so on, but as it were, laying out the foundations of the polity. It is, I think, an aspect of the genius of the United States that its constitutional foundation. And we know, of course, that this was philosophically informed. For a long time, the figure who was looked to was Locke and Lockeans, but Locke particularly. But in more recent times, there has been, the last 25 years and so on, there has been some awareness, growing awareness of the role of Scottish philosophical thinking in influencing the minds of the drafters of the Constitution and those who participate in the constitutional debates. And I offer James Wilson as an example of that, but the followers of Thomas Reid were very influential through the Presbyterian presence in the United States, including at Princeton, where the Constitutional Convention moved to at one point. So the philosophical input, I think, is significant. Now, this idea of the separation of powers is, of course, an extremely interesting one. We don't have it in the United Kingdom, or at least we do have it with respect to the judiciary on the one hand and a government on the other. But, of course, the chief executive is also part of the legislative body here, the Prime Minister, the Cabinet, and so on. It is an interesting question. We can see why, of course, Wilson prevailed in the constitutional debates in advocating this, something that, by the way, was opposed by Washington, for example, and I think Benjamin Franklin was opposed to it as well. But he prevailed in this because what he was concerned with was a sort of checks and balances, containing the power of the magistrate, the president, but also avoiding the politicization of the judiciary, and so on. Now, I think it is a feature of the United States that to some extent, the separation of powers, the barriers between the powers have become porous. And the example that, well, I just give two examples really. One is the one that Brian Leiter has discussed, and I think I'm very sympathetic to what he has to say. I think it's a very useful essay, certainly a very useful essay for provoking discussion. The extent to which the judiciary has become a legislative body, particularly the federal Supreme Court. To some extent, this is true of state Supreme Courts, but certainly the federal Supreme Court has become the highest legislative body, because through its function of interpreting the Constitution or interpreting legislation in the light of the Constitution, it has the power to determine whether something is law or whether it is not, and to determine further, if it is law, what its meaning is. So in a sense, the Supreme Court is becoming a legislative body. As I say, of course, it can only consider cases that are brought to it, but of course it makes decisions about what cases it will consider, and it's petitioned politically to consider certain cases and not others. So there's a case in point in which the judiciary may be at risk of becoming politicized. But another case is one in which, through executive office, the president, concerned here with the United States, but this could generalize, the president makes law. Now, because how the president does that is through executive powers. And we've seen this recently with more than one occasion with President Trump in his efforts to try to bypass the legislature and to effectively do something that's extensionally equivalent to legislating. And of course, he's been challenged over this, most recently over the question of whether or not the president has the power to command the army. I mean, state troopers are a different sort of thing, National Guard are a different sort of thing, but actually to command the regular army as into policing, in this case in DC, but it could be anywhere for that matter. And that again might look to be a breach of the power of the legislative body on the one hand and the executive on the other. Now, I think that one thing, I mean, I mentioned earlier on that just at the late 1960s and 70s, an issue was civil disobedience. I think an issue for us today, very prominently, is the question of policing and the question of government control. And the discussions that have gone on the last few days in the United States, which have been reported here, about defunding the police. I mean, this is because this needs to be understood and interpreted in various ways. But really, this is a very radical suggestion. I mean, it's been present in progressive leftist writings for quite a while, but now it's entered as well the mainstream of thought. So I do think that the question of constitutions, how they define and how they arbitrate between and how they regulate the different components of the state is an important question, requiring a lot of philosophical thought, but it's been made urgent by the circumstances, not just of COVID, but of going back to 2008, the economic collapse. A whole series of events have made this question of the relationship between government and the arms of government, or the arms of the state, I'm sorry, highly pertinent and relevant. And at a time when other countries are considering constitutions, or the power of legislative bodies to revoke constitutions, to amend them and so on, this becomes a very important matter.
Thank you, John. Now, I have a question from Ben Sachs, who's our moderator, of course, and he writes, do you think there is any connection between the idea that you were speaking of, namely action preceding reason, any connection between that and the idea advanced nowadays by psychologists and behavioral economists that most of our actions are so-called system one or automatic, and that when asked to explain what we've done, our answers are usually post hoc rationalization?
Yes, this is very interesting. Of course, this has been a feature of a more general phenomenon. So let me just say what the general phenomenon is, then the feature, and then the particularity. The general phenomenon, to which philosophers themselves have contributed, famously through Quine's attack on the analytic-synthetic distinction, and Morton White and others, of sort of deprivileging the a priori over the a posteriori, in some cases actually sort of evacuating the notion of the a priori, but as it were, in denying that there is an investigation into concepts that can be engaged in independently of the question of the empirical application of these concepts, or the application of these concepts to reality more generally. Philosophy has sort of deprivileged the a priori perspective, and of course, in doing so, this has brought benefits, but it's opened itself up to it, as it were, dissolved the boundaries between philosophy and certain empirical inquiries, including economics and psychology, anthropology and sociology, and so on and such like. Now, there is a particular trend within some of these subjects, particularly within psychology, to try to look. So it's one thing, as it were, to take psychology seriously, or economic theory, or whatever else it may be. But there's a further feature here, which is the claim of some psychologists that folk psychology, what we ordinarily think of as the explanation of action in terms of belief, desire, and rational processes and so on, is a kind of after-the-fact rationalization, that the real work is done by something else. Now, that, of course, is a contentious matter. But what I think is less contentious, though not uncontentious, is the idea that I was advocating, that, as it were, reason begins in action, its first place is in action, and then, as it were, is abstracted in reflection, and that ideas, as it were, are the products of reflection upon action, that the concepts that we have about ourselves, it's not that they're after the fact rationalizations, it's that what was, on the view that I'm advocating, what was operating in action really was reason, but it was reason prior to its articulation at the level of reflection. Whereas the issue that's been raised just now is that what's operating in the production of action isn't reason at all.
Thank you. I have a question about pedagogy. What would you say are the pedagogical implications of your conception of practical philosophy? The work of people like Mill and Locke was clearly influenced by their experiences in spheres of practice, whereas prominent ideal theory thinkers in political and moral theory tend not to have any similar practical experiences. What do you think?
Yes, well, of course, academic philosophy has become a profession in a way that it wasn't historically. I mean, most of the famous philosophers were, you know, tutors to aristocratic families, or lens grinders in one famous case, or lawyers or doctors in case of Locke and so on. Locke was in charge of the department that regulated taxes and trade, and so was knowledgeable about and concerned about the position of the colonists in North America, and so his own reflections on political, not only that, but of course other events were closer to home. His own reflections on politics are deeply rooted in the experience of arbitrating competing claims and things of that kind, and claims of sovereignty and independence and responsibility and rights. Mill, of course, was a member of Parliament for a short period, and was very much a social activist, inheriting that from his father, along with George Birkbeck, Brown, Bentham, and so on, the so-called liberal utilitarians. So all of those people were concerned in reform. And there, I think the philosophy is a bit thin now, but that's a different matter. With regard to pedagogy, what I think the implication of this might be that in the teaching of moral philosophy, of course, there's many things that go under the heading of moral philosophy, but in the teaching of moral philosophy broadly considered, there's great value attaching to beginning with, as it were, history. I don't mean the history of moral philosophy, I mean the history of events, talking about events, and contemporary history as well. I mean, looking at situations, and then, as it were, doing the philosophy out of those, rather than teaching people philosophical theories and then applying those to the issues. You know, so often education in moral philosophy has taken the form of teaching people broad theories, deontological, consequentialist, virtue, and so on, and then saying, so what would the virtue ethicist say? What would the deontologist say? What would the utilitarian say? And even setting these as essay topics, you know, consider the question of lying from the point of view of a utilitarian or from the point of view of a Kantian. And this seems to me, from an educational point of view, just gets it back to front. And of course, it also inculcates and strengthens the disposition of mind that leads to applied philosophy, to the idea that engaging with a practical question is bringing to bear some pre-established set of ethical ideas.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you.
These are very articulate questions that have been sent. I think.
Well, that's what we would expect from listeners to such a lecture.
Well, hopefully, but you've evidently inspired some, you know, a lot of thinking.
Thank you.
Pedro Farao, maybe also from Brazil, he writes about how do you reconcile basically what Elizabeth Anscombe says, or one of the things that she says in Modern Moral Philosophy, with your emphasis, your positive emphasis on casuistry, because this questioner reminds us that, let me just see, there's quite a lengthy worded question. He says that she equates casuistry with the attempt to answer the question, what is it right to do in such and such circumstances? And she apparently in this paper treats that as a misguided question.
I'm not sure that I would agree with the last part of that.
The interpretation.
Yeah, the interpretation. I think that, I mean, we just have to be brief now. Modern moral philosophy is a very interesting essay for all sorts of reasons. I don't just mean in terms of its intellectual content, but as it were, in trying to analyze and parse it, one has to look at its context. And it's really part of this barely controlled rage that she felt, and it issues in a whole variety of things. Does Oxford philosophy corrupt the youth of today? The BBC broadcast Steeped in Blood, a short piece that she wrote. But anyway, it's part of this rage that she feels that moral philosophy has nothing serious to say about the injustices of her day, because, I mean, for which the most conspicuous one, she thinks, is the intentional voluntary killing of the innocent. And she thinks it's got nothing to say about it because of its consequentialism. Because it really doesn't, as it were, respect justice as an inviolable norm. Now, I don't want to get involved in the philosophical rights and wrongs of that, but she does think that, as it were, casuistical thinking, though she doesn't use that terminology because of its pejorative connotations, but she does think that we have to think through in cases. And so, for example, what becomes a more prominent theme, certainly by the time of War and Murder, you might say it becomes the theme, is a defense of war. I mean, that's to say that although her strictures are directed against a war in 1939, and again, in reflection after the war in Mr. Truman's degree, by War and Murder, she thinks that one of the unsettling causes of thinking in these matters is pacifism. She thinks that pacifism is an inappropriate position, and so, but she gets to that by thinking through cases, thinking through the circumstances and conditions under which it would be justified to resort to violence in one's own defence, and then the question of thinking about if there are those for whom you have a special responsibility who are not able to defend themselves, do you have a responsibility to defend them, and so on. So it is worth thinking through the case, or say a series of cases that in which she develops her views. So I think there'd be a sort of question of interpretation of what's going on there that would have to be resolved.
Thank you. Will you take one more question from
yes, of course.
Philosopher who's, I suppose, far away, but who has some connections with St Andrews? This is from Roy Sorensen.
Oh, yes.
He asks, well, he says, the mention of casuistry led me to expect discussion of G.E. Moore.
Yeah.
His distinction between ethics and casuistry was cited in defense of the professionalization of academic ethics. Was Moore an impediment in the development of public philosophy?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think Roy Sorensen is in Texas, isn't he? Isn't he in Austin these days? I don't know.
That's where, yes.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Yes.
So we've been close neighbours, or relatively close neighbours of late. This is, of course, a very important point. If one were telling the story of moral philosophy in the 20th century, then Moore's Principia Ethica and Ethics are extremely important in this, because what he says, the philosophical subject, as opposed to moralizing, not moralizing thought of pejoratively, but as well giving moral opinion and trying to resolve moral questions, the philosophical question is not what is right or what is good in a particular case, but what goodness is. And thereby he creates the subject that has been dominant within moral philosophy through the 20th century, namely metaethics. So I think that G.E. Moore removes ethical inquiry from the sphere of practice. I mean, philosophical inquiry from the sphere of practice. Of course, it was part and parcel of this that Moore was supremely confident about what the goods were. And of course, famously had his sort of Bloomsbury view of what the goods were, aesthetic experience, friendship, and things of that sort. So he thought that anybody of appropriate formation and background would know what's good. So in a sense, that didn't need to be discussed. But in any case, he didn't think that was a philosophical inquiry, which things are good. The philosophical inquiry is what is goodness, and that, of course, takes us into the whole sphere of meta-ethics rather than ethics, properly speaking. So thank you, Roy, and others for your questions.
Well, I think we should draw to a close now, and we still have some more questions. We've obviously inspired a lot of interest and curiosity, and it's a shame that we can't have more. But so viewers who've asked questions and other viewers who've taken part silently, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
And I think it seems to fall to me to thank John Haldane for his very generous, rich, fascinating, wide-ranging lecture, and it certainly does justice to the occasion. Thank you very much indeed, John.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah.